Now, having told you about the different levels of ecology, one of the things we now need to learn about is what kind of factors we actually need to look for. And the easiest ones to start, really, before we get into all the different interactions that organisms have with one another, let's take a look at what the environment offers in terms of important factors. Now, the abiotic factors ultimately are the ones that the organisms cannot influence. I mentioned that before. So as a consequence, they are the things that determine where organisms can live. If the organism doesn't like those conditions, then the organism will have to move because it really can't change it. And so, since these factors are not influenced by the organisms, you can expect them to be large-scale kinds of factors, and many of them are really large-scale kind of factors, but there are sometimes also relatively small-scale ones. So it's a good mixture of different things as you observe them. And of course, as I mentioned, in relation to the snow and the temperature, even we have to deal with all these kinds of factors. In particular, we're not just dealing with temperature, but what does that temperature do? Well, one of the things that we have here is if there's too much heat, we end up experiencing water loss. If we can't find water, then of course we have a problem. In more temperate climates, this is of course what's happening now on the East Coast, you don't have that problem with excessive heat, but you have to deal with seasons, which at some point might dump a load of snow on you. So clearly, abiotic factors are sometimes very difficult to deal with for organisms, and these organisms therefore have to be adapted in a certain way to their environment, or the abiotic factors may overcome them. Now, what kind of abiotic factors do organisms experience? There are some very fundamental ones. For example, what energy source an organism has. Now, ultimately, when we look at energy and where energy on our planet comes from, ultimately it all comes from the sun. And when you look at the sunlight coming in, of course, there are some issues with the sunlight. One of these would be availability of sunlight. When we're in a lecture hall, we have no availability of sunlight, but you can step outside and there's usually plenty of it, unless you go deep down into an aquatic environment where at some point the light will not be able to filter through. So if you go into the oceans or into a deep lake, you will find that as you increase your depth, you're going to get less light. So if you want to live at a certain depth, you have to be able to live with less. And so those are the kind of things that are very important. Fading light with depth is something that many organisms that directly need sunlight have to face. If you don't directly need sunlight, then perhaps you can somehow eke out a living without. We know very little still about the deep depths of the oceans where there is no light. We know that there is a huge diversity of organisms, but we don't know exactly how they all live and deal with the absence of light. When you're on land in the terrestrial environment, then shading could be a problem. Shading could be a problem, but also the lack of shade could be a problem. And so you can benefit from having a significant energy source such as the sun, but it can also be a problem. As a consequence, both plants and animals have all kinds of different adaptations that allow them to address this sunlight issue, especially when it comes to extreme environments. I mean, if you think about a desert, that's a type of an extreme environment because of the high heat in certain times of the year and the lack of water. Or if you're looking at dark areas, if you look at the depths of the ocean, that's another kind of extreme environment. So sunlight has many different influences on organisms' lives. There is one alternative energy source, and that's energy from the warm core of the Earth itself. This is a very limited resource because it exists only at a few places that makes it tolerable for organisms. If you live right at the edge of a volcano, for example, that's a problem because not only do you get the potential of heat for your energy requirements, but with it also comes such high temperature in the form of molten lava that you end up perhaps becoming injured. So volcanoes are not really a very good source of earth heat, but hydrothermal vents deep down in the oceans, they can be. And in fact, they don't only produce warmth where there normally isn't much warmth, but they also provide certain types of bacteria with chemicals that they can actually convert even in the absence of sunlight. And so they have become chemotrophic. They eat those chemicals essentially. Rather than being phototrophic, which means you exist by photosynthesis, these are chemotrophic and they can exist by chemosynthesis. So that's an entire different way of life when it comes to these organisms. And I'm just going to write this down so that you know how to spell it. Chemosynthesis. Now, people didn't know this for the longest time. We didn't know what was down there. Only in the last 50 years or so have our technological advances allowed us to figure out some of these things. And you'll find down there are some very strange kinds of organisms, very large tube worms as shown here. And these kind of tube worms have basically eliminated some of the structural components you would find in normal worms. They have eliminated their intestine to an extent where that intestine now is teeming with these bacteria. And there is a very interesting symbiotic relationship where both the bacteria and these worms benefit, and the worms don't even need a stomach to be able to do it. So very interesting things when it comes to a very unusual type of environment like the hydrothermal vent environment. Temperature in general is something that we need to be very conscious of when we look at the environment. Clearly, environmental temperature has a very important aspect of how organisms live, in particular when the organism does not have a system inside of it that gives it heat. You and I, we have an internal mechanism that keeps us warm. And as a consequence, we are relatively independent of temperature. Sure, we feel the extremes of temperature, cold and hot, but we have a very broad capacity to tolerate temperature differences. And so living in a place like here, where the temperature in the morning can be freezing, and then in the afternoon it can still be 70 or 80 degrees, that's a pretty extreme difference in how much the temperature changes in a given day. Now, there are organisms that don't do that, clearly. If you think of amphibians and reptiles, they don't have that internal mechanism, and so if they want to experience warmth, they have to go and find a place that's warm. There are some organisms that do have, again, extreme adaptations. So, for example, when you go to Yellowstone National Park, as is shown here, you may have a type of bacterium. In this case, it's not so easy to see in your copy there, but along the edge there's actually an orange area, and these are all bacteria. The orange area extends up to here, and it's all this area here where you find these bacterial blooms, literally. And they are essentially living in boiling water. Now, boiling water is inhospitable to most organisms, but not to these guys. So there are organisms that have extreme temperature adaptations, both hot and cold. A third important aspect of abiotic characteristics is the presence of water and the form it takes. Now we know that water is on Earth in three forms: solid, liquid, gas. Solid, ice; liquid, normal water; and then gas, water vapor. And so wherever you can get the water in the environment, you'd have to find it. Now, if it is let's say a snowy day and you're by the lake, you can see water in all three forms right then and there. Now, different organisms may use different kinds of water. There are also some problems associated with water. Now, if you think of a freshwater organism, the freshwater organism picks up and is surrounded by water that basically has very little salt in it. And since most organisms in their cells accumulate a certain number of chemicals, if you have a cell that's a high concentration and the water is a low concentration, then you would expect that the water wants to get into that cell to create chemical equilibrium. If you remember, this was a while ago when we talked about chemical equilibrium. But that doesn't happen because organisms have certain adaptations that prevent them from doing this. So as long as the organism is alive, you're going to find that it can actively change its water chemistry. It can osmoregulate, that's the technical term, and this osmoregulation keeps the cells from bursting. The opposite is true for marine organisms. There, the salt concentration is greater than what's in their cells, and so in those cases you might expect that the water is trying to reach equilibrium by moving from within the cells to the outside. Well, you can do a lot of equilibrium reaching in the ocean. You're never going to make the ocean less salty. And so the organisms are always going to be in a difficult environment, but they again have ways to balance their water content against high salt concentration. And so in both cases, there are problems. Now, if you are an organism that will do all of these things, if you think of salmon, for example, salmon start out in a freshwater environment, then they move downriver and into the oceans, and then eventually they come back and do the reverse. So clearly they have to have a highly specialized way of dealing with both of these conditions. Never at the same time, clearly, but early life is going to be all in freshwater. Later in life they come back to it, but in between they have to deal with all the salt water. So those are problems if you have plenty of water, but it's not exactly the kind of water you're looking for. On land, you have a different kind of problem. On land, you have too little water. And so organisms have to deal with doing with less. In some cases, it means that organisms can even pick up some of the gases from the air. There are plants that have air roots, for example. And so having too little water is an entirely different problem. Fourthly, nutrients. Obviously, we need nutrients, and it's clear that we need a certain nutrient load in order to exist in an environment. And if you are, let's say, a plant, or if you're a small bacterium and you need to get your nutrients from somewhere, then you better be in a soil type that has those nutrients. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to thrive. And so when you're looking at where plants exist, you'll find very often that plants are not uniformly distributed across an environment. You'll find that plants exist in certain places where perhaps nutrients accumulate. If, for example, you look at an area, a landscape, I'm drawing a hilly landscape. And in this hilly landscape, you will find plants primarily in areas where the runoff from the hills, based on rain, where the runoff concentrates the nutrients. And so you find usually very few plants colonizing the top of the hills, but a greater diversity of both plants, of any kind of plant, bushes, trees, and so on, accumulate the areas right in between those hills. The hills where they come together and where they form little valleys, that's sometimes all you need. And so you'll find, as a consequence of this, that plants tend to be unevenly distributed in an environment. So patchy distribution is really a fact of life for many different kinds of organisms. Obviously, if the plants are what you seek as a source of food or as a source of shelter, then your distribution is also going to be patchy if the plants are patchily distributed. Now, it turns out that this is a very dynamic aspect of abiotic factors, because the composition of the soil may change in different areas. And this is nowhere more pronounced than when it comes to the chemistry of rivers and streams. It changes based on the habitat they flow through. And so when you are looking at rivers and the color of the water and the nutrient content, it sometimes has surprising changes in it from one area to the next. And that is why in many rivers you don't find the same kinds of organisms all along the river. If you go, for example, into the Mississippi River area, and you look at the different areas in it, you'll find that there is the Mississippi Delta. That's one kind of area. You find areas where the Mississippi is a very broad stream. You find where it goes through areas of particular soil nutrients. And as a consequence of this, you'll find that the organisms that this water has in it also change. So even though for us, you could take a boat that takes you all the way from the Mississippi Delta nearly to the source of the river, you will find that along the way, even though it's all water, it doesn't just all mix and is equal from top to bottom. You'll find that there's a lot of mixing, and some of this was unexpected. So when you're looking at the composition of nutrients, you would look at soil structure along the river. You would look at the pH in the river. You would look at the general availability of such important nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and then you can perhaps figure out who can live there and who doesn't. In addition, you might have levels of dissolved oxygen. In some lakes, for example, the bottom of the lake really doesn't have any oxygen in it whatsoever, so the bottoms of deep lakes are sometimes dead space. There's not enough mixing that reaches down to these depths to integrate any dissolved oxygen into the water. So those kind of things are very important when it comes to nutrients. Wind is a very specific kind of characteristic, but even though you might not consider it very important in comparison to energy requirements like sunlight or things like temperature, it does have a fundamental importance. For example, wind patterns, and in this case, you would see that the wind comes from a specific direction. What do you think in this picture the wind comes from? It comes from the left because the way the branches are pointing is to the right. And so this is the kind of thing you'll see. So the growth patterns of certain organisms are determined by where the wind comes from. But more than that, there are a lot of organisms that depend on the wind for dispersal of pollen and seeds. If you don't disperse your pollen or seeds, then your offspring could be competing with you for nutrients. Now, there are many trees that simply drop their seeds right where they stand, and of course that's one strategy. But it may be a better strategy for certain types of organisms to have seeds that float better and that get picked up by the wind and therefore get moved farther away from the individual that generated them. So dispersal is very important. And then it even is sometimes a matter of life and death whether the wind exists to blow nutrients into an area. And so there's all kinds of relevance to what wind does. Now we do have periodic disturbances that are abiotic, and these are not necessarily something that influences organisms all the time. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't happen. In general, these are catastrophic in nature, and if there is a catastrophic impact, then obviously that's going to change how the organisms exist. Examples of these include irregular ones. Irregular in the sense that they are not occurring seasonally and they don't have any kind of real predictability. So earthquakes, there's a little bit of predictability, of course, based on where exactly on the planet you are, but there is really no guarantee how big of an earthquake or when it occurs. The same thing with volcanism and most types of fire. Fire in the sense non-human caused fires as opposed to human caused fires. Now we do have a little bit of a fire season, but it used to be that I listed fire in this periodic disturbance. And the reason why I listed fire in the periodic disturbance is because if it's a dry season, like the summer, then you expect more fires. But over the last 10 years or so, since we've had this persistent drought in California, that type of periodicity has gone away. And so now you can basically have pretty nasty fires at any time of the year. And so I moved that up. So this is something that has changed based on changes in the environment. So fire used to be something I considered more of a cyclical phenomenon, having to do with seasons perhaps. But now it is becoming a little bit more irregular, and there is sometimes no real reason why it happens, because the forests are dry in general. But some of these, hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods, tend to have more of a seasonality to them. We have hurricane season, which goes from the 1st of June to the 30th of November. There are more important times of the year when there are tornadoes, strings of tornadoes and others, and so on. Now, one of the things that's interesting to observe is that when there is a disturbance, the environment can recover. It recovers through something called ecological succession. And so in the image there, you can see on the left, I hope, that there was a fire, and there's basically nothing green to be seen. Everything is charred, and the forest is devoid of vegetation. On the right, this is within a few months of that. Of course, the burning releases a certain amount of nutrition, and so some of the carbon can then return to the ground as fertilizer of sorts, some of the carbon, the nitrogen, and so on. And in fact, these types of disturbances are in some places necessary for new growth. There are some trees in the mountains here that have seeds that require to experience fire. They need to be kind of like popcorn. They need to be thrown into the fire for a while before they can germinate. And this is something that people also didn't know, that there are really certain organisms that need that fire. And the reason why is because the trees, over time with natural selection, the picture, are releasing seeds at times when the rest of the forest is now devoid of vegetation. If you are a tree and you throw your seed into a thicket where there's all kinds of other plants growing already, then that seed is going to have a limited amount of success because it competes with all this other stuff. Whereas if your seed is going to germinate right after a fire, then there's nobody else around. And so that reduces competition, and therefore it becomes much more effective if you're going to grow in that kind of environment.